V'gam eretz zobas chola v'dvoshi v'zeh pirya, efes ki oz ha'om. The Meraglim come back and they give a double message. They're sent out to spy out the land and report back. And according to the original plan, Klal Yisrael were within a few days of entering the land of Israel. The spies come back and they say, yes, of course, it's a wonderful land. Eretz zovas chola v'dvosh v'zeh pirya. Look at this amazing fruit of the land. But guess what? Efes. But. Efes means the big but, the big zero. In other words, what they were saying was, our chances of conquering and settling this land are zero. And when Klal Yisrael heard that, vayivku ha'om balayla hahu, they sat and cried. Say Chazal, this was a bechiyah l'dorot. This was a crying which sent ripple effects throughout Jewish history, a moment of loss of emunah, loss of optimism, loss of self-confidence, a loss of sense of direction of where they're going to, a total disaster, which resulted in a whole generation, the Dar HaMidbar, having to live and die in the Midbar for 40 years. Contrast this to the Haftarah. Sefer Yeshua chapter 2, 40 years later, Yeshua sends 2 spies into the land of Israel in order to check it out before he actually enters the land, and they come back and they say a wonderful report. They come back and they say, Ki nosan Hashem b'yodeinu es kol ha'oretz, v'gam nomoigu kol yoshvei ha'oretz miponeinu. The citizens, the residents of the land are terrified of us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us the land. It is b'yadeinu. It's within our grasp. Let's go and settle and conquer the land of Israel. A very contrasting message and a contrasting story. And I want to have a look at what went wrong the first time that was done correctly the second time. And one of the interesting, most striking details is in the description of the Meraglim themselves. In Shlach-Lecha, the Meraglim are described as Kol Nasi Behem. Each one was a Nasi. Each one was a respected and high-profile leader. Kulam Anoshim, all people of repute. Roshei B'nai Yisrael Heimah. Interesting, 3 different ways of describing what levels of distinction these people had among Klal Yisrael. Roshei B'nai Yisrael, Nasiim, everyone a prince. Kulam Anoshim, people of status. And guess what? Who were they? And then we get all the names. Reuven, Shimon, this, we get the whole list of the names. Contrast this to who were the Meraglim that Yeshua sent. And you look in chapter 2, Yeshua tells us the story. Who were they? It's not written. The Torah doesn't tell us their name at all. We don't know who they were. Chazal tell us, Chazal had a Maseirah, that the 2 Meraglim that Yeshua sent were Kalev ben Yefuneh and Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. But that's not written in the Torah. And if it's not written in the Chumash, there must be a reason why it's not written in the Chumash. And the reason is hinted at in a Medrash Chazal, who says, what does it mean that Yeshua sent them Cheresh? Cheresh means silently. So silently means, of course, every spy is sent silently. No spy is sent wearing a label saying that he's a spy. There's always subterfuges in spying out another country. But what the point is that when he sent them, they weren't sent with a great public event, with great knowledge of Klal Yisrael. They weren't sent with a public send-off. They were sent silently. And who were they? And they weren't named. Nobody knew who they were. Say Chazal, al tikri cheresh elo cheres. Here's part of the genius of Midrash Chazal, using the Hebrew language and the layers of meaning within the Hebrew language to give us a deeper insight into an event. Cheresh means silently, but cheresh says, al tikri cheresh elo cheres. They made themselves like kli cheres, like earthenware vessels. What is the meaning of earthenware vessels? And here's something very, very profound. We find, for example, in the Gemara in Nedarim, Daf Nun, the Gemara there says that Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah was often a spokesperson towards the Roman government and the emperor. And on one occasion, the daughter of the emperor said to Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah, why is it that such wonderful wisdom is in such an ugly vessel. She says to Reb Shua ben Chananya, why are you so disheveled, and why do you not groom yourself properly, and why are you an ugly person? Your ugliness disturbs me, even though I agree that you contain amazing spiritual and Torah wisdom. It bothered her, that contrast. Says Reb Shua ben Chananya to the daughter of the emperor, of the Caesar, he says, let me ask you a question. Traditional rabbinic way of answering a question. Let me ask you a question, he says to her, your father, the emperor, has got massive cellars of vintage wine. What sort of vessels does he keep the wine in? She says, well, traditionally wine is kept in earthenware vessels. He says, pas nicht. The emperor should use earthenware vessels. Ordinary people use ordinary vessels. The emperor should use vessels of gold and silver. So she said, yes, you're right. So she went and she took over a whole area of the wine cellars, and she changed the vessels into gold and silver. And sure enough, what happened? All the wine went off. The wine in the gold and silver keli went off. She came back to Reb Shua ben Chananya. Reb Shua ben Chananya said, you see, things of great value can only exist within simple vessels. A vessel is meant to protect and contain its content. But the minute the vessel is of great stature and very important and of great wealth, it interacts negatively with its content. It doesn't protect the content, it destroys the content. And therefore, he says, I don't pay attention to my chitzonius, to my appearances, and that way it helps me to preserve the Torah. She asks him, incidentally, tell me, are there no handsome men who are also knowledgeable? So he gives her a great rabbinic answer in the Gemara there in the Dorim Daf Nun. He says, yes, of course there are great handsome men who are knowledgeable, but if they were less handsome, they'd be more knowledgeable. Okay, leave that Gemara aside for a second, but what do we see in Chazal? That the idea of a kli cheres is something which on the one hand is the simplest and cheapest of all kelim. On the other hand, if you want to preserve something of spiritual value, you need a kli which is not important, which in its own right. Something which can, in a sense, dedicate itself completely to its content and not be full of its own prestige and its own value and its own importance. And here comes the difference between the first story of the Meraglim in Shlach-Lecha and the second story of the Meraglim in Sefer Yeshua. The first time the people who were sent with full of their own covet. They were kol nosi bohem. Each one was kulam anoshim, people of great prestige. That prestige tripped them up. And here you find a very interesting reference to this idea in the writings of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, writing his great and famous book, Mesilas Yesharim, 300 years ago. In chapter 11, in Midas HaNekiyos, he speaks about various different midas, various different personality traits that a person can, it can distort a person's perception of the world. And one of them is kavod. A person who's too obsessed with his own kavod, he will perceive the world in a distorted way. He will be, in his mind, always concerned to preserve his own kavod and concerned with his own status and his own importance. And he's willing to lose everything. He's willing to lose everything just to preserve his own importance. And Ramchal there quotes the Zohar. And the Zohar says that was the problem of the Meraglim. The Zohar says the Meraglim, the problem was that they were people of great stature, and they felt, and they understood, that if Klal Yisrael went into the land of Israel then and there, they would lose their stature. And that somehow distorted their perception. They couldn't come back and give a report and say, yes, full speed ahead, we're going into Eretz Yisrael. They couldn't do that because of their own kavod. And only Yoshua and Kalev were saved. Kalev was saved, according to Chazal, because he went to daven in Hebron and in Moras Machpelah. He went to daven for Zechus Avos. So Kalev connected himself to Zechus Avos, and that saved him from the kavod matter. And Yeshua, of course, was saved by the Torah, by his knowledge of Torah. He was the Talmid Muvak of Moshe Rabbeinu. Yeshua Benun lo Moshe mitocha ohel. Yeshua had never left Moshe Rabbeinu's side, and he was the greatest Talmud that Moshe Rabbeinu ever had. So Yeshua had the Torah, Kalev had the Zechus Avos. The others were also very choshev people. but their chashivas tripped them up because they were too full of themselves. Yeshua sent people cheresh. He sent people who knew that in order to fulfill their mission, they had to exercise the quality of anova and put aside their own ego and their own prestige and their own status, and by doing so they can relate to the truth. This is a very, very interesting and profound idea that we find generally in the Chazal and in the Torah, in the idea of what does it mean to be a shliach. A successful shliach is somebody who is able to put aside his own ego and his own ideas and his own personality and be completely just reflect the mission that the Mishaleach, the person who sent him, charged him with. This, incidentally, is one of the great secrets of the worldwide network of Chabad Shluchim. They call themselves Shluchim rather than Shlichim because that's the language of Chazal. Chazal say, Shlucho shel Adam kamosa. Use the word Shluach, but a Shluach and a Shliach is actually the same thing. Slightly different nuance, but the Shluchim of Chabad worldwide, there must be 6,000 or 7,000 of them worldwide, bringing Torah and Yahadut and Yiddishkeit to the furthest corners of the world, to even speaking as a Litvak, one can't fail to admire that work that they do. But what is one of the secrets of success? If you meet a Shliach, like a Shliach Chabad, like I have done on a few occasions, and you meet them, whether you meet them in, I don't know, in Palo Alto, or you meet them in Johannesburg, or you meet them in Venice, or you meet them in the Far East, and you ask them, what is your role here in this town? So he doesn't say, I'm a Rav, or I'm a Mechanech, or I'm a Dayan. He says, I'm a Shliach of the Rebbe. He's a Shliach. And as a Shliach, he puts aside, the code word of a Shliach means you put aside your own ego. You're only operating on behalf of the Mishaleach. And that gives you the strength of the person sending you. That strength then courses through your mind and through your soul and through your veins and enables you to do things greater than you could do as an individual. The Meraglim of Yeshua went as Shalichim of Yeshua. That's all. They had no personal interests. They had no personal names. They weren't Kulam Anoshim, Kol Nosi Bohem. They were people of Anova. And throughout history, the hallmark of genuine leaders of Klal Yisrael and great Rabbanim and Poskim has always been Anova. But people are willing to give away the whole of Eretz Yisrael just to preserve their own kavod and their own stature and their own power. And that is really one of the lessons, one of the most striking features of this whole story of Shlach-Lecha, that the Meraglim sent in Shlach-Lecha were a disaster, but the Meraglim sent by Yeshua are a model for us of what it means to be a Shliach. Like the Kohanim. The Kohanim are considered to be both Shluchei D'Rabbanon, Shluchei D'Rachmana, they're Shluchei of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Shluchei Didan. Taisa says in Yumel Yutes that a Kohen has got a double job. He's Shluchei Didan, he's also a Shliach of ours to represent us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's also Shluchei D'Rachmana. He's also a Shliach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But whatever he doesn't do with his ego, and he doesn't do looking for kavod and looking for status. He does with Mesiras Nefesh. And that was really the story that the Mesilas Yesharim picks up out of Shlach-Lecha, to understand what it means to put one's ego aside and be completely dedicated only to the mission. And in that way, the second batch of Meraglim really give us the true message, Ki nosan Hashem biyodenu es haaretz, that Eretz Yisrael is indeed something which is biyadenu, that we are able against all predictions and against all statistics and against all political commentaries and against all efforts by other nations. Klal Yisrael is able to conquer, settle, develop Eretz Yisrael, and to see the Tuv Ha'aretz, both the external Tuv of Eretz Zovas Cholav Dvash and the Tov Hagonus, the inner spiritual Tov, Ki Eini Hashem Elokecha Ba, Bereishis Hashana Achris Hashana, the connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is in Eretz Yisrael. That is what we can see every day of the year. V'chein Yirot.